While I was laid up in a hospital bed recovering from a heart attack, my wife turned my home into a circus and didn't think I'd make it back to see it. When I finally walked through my front door 3 days earlier than expected, I didn't find peace. I found beer bottles in the flower beds, strangers asleep on my porch swing, and a bonfire smoldering in the backyard where my flag used to hang. The smell of cigarette smoke hit me before I even stepped inside, and there, sitting in my favorite chair, my chair, was my sister-in-law, drinking from one of my mugs like she owned the place. My wife, Carla, didn't even flinch. She looked at me, half smiling, and said, "Well, guess the surprise is ruined." I didn't say a word. Not then. I just kept walking, past the trashed living room, past the broken frames on the wall, and into the kitchen. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I never thought I'd have to call. This wasn't just a mess. This was war. And I was about to take back everything they thought I'd never need again. Frank was the kind of man who believed in earning every inch of ground he stood on. 62 years old, a retired electrical lineman from rural Texas. He'd spent 4 decades climbing poles in storms and brutal heat, saving every dime he could. After his first wife passed, Frank poured his grief into something that would last. A single-story ranch-style home he'd built with his own 2 hands. Not just paid for, built. From the cedar porch to the concrete slab under the shed, every part of that house bore his fingerprints. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, a symbol of sweat, sacrifice, and stability. 2 years ago, hoping for a fresh start, he married Carla, a vibrant bakery owner in her mid-40s. She moved in with her 23-year-old son, Troy, and for a while things were calm. Frank liked the idea of laughter in the halls again. He didn't mind covering most of the bills or helping Troy find work, even if the kid seemed allergic to effort. Then Carla's older sister Denise started visiting, a sharp-tongued whirlwind who always found something to critique. The way Frank arranged the tools in his shed, his taste in furniture, even how he drank his coffee. "You need to modernize, Frankie," she'd say with a smirk, propping her feet on his table. Frank let it slide, not because he was weak, but because he valued peace over petty arguments. He figured Carla would set boundaries, eventually. But slowly, something shifted. Carla stopped asking before rearranging the house. Troy began treating the property like his own. And Denise, she came and went like she owned the deed. Frank felt the walls closing in on the life he'd worked so hard to protect. But still he held back. After all, it was just noise. He never imagined they'd go so far as to treat his home like it was already theirs. It was supposed to be a relaxing Saturday. Frank had taken his old aluminum boat out to the lake before sunrise, hoping to catch some bass and clear his mind. He was just casting his second line when a sudden, crushing pain gripped his chest. At first, he thought it was just heartburn or maybe a pulled muscle, but when his vision started to blur and the world tilted, he knew something was wrong. Bad wrong. He collapsed right there on the dock. A nearby fisherman, a stranger, saw him go down and called 911. By the time paramedics arrived, Frank's pulse was erratic, his breathing shallow. He was airlifted to a hospital 2 hours away, barely hanging on. Doctors diagnosed a serious cardiac arrhythmia. "You were lucky," one of them said. "Another 15 minutes, and we'd be having a different conversation." Frank was sedated and placed under constant observation. For 5 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Carla visited once, maybe twice, but never stayed long. The nurses said she was upbeat, even joking, talking about moving forward and restarting life. At first, Frank thought it was just her way of coping, but something about her tone stuck in his mind, even in his dazed state. On the 6th day, as he finally began to regain strength, a nurse leaned in and said gently, "Your wife mentioned some kind of gathering at the house? Something about a celebration?" Frank's stomach turned. What the hell could they be celebrating while he was still in a hospital bed? He tried to call home, but no one answered. He asked Carla to visit again, but she said she was busy handling things. That was the moment Frank knew something wasn't right, and the house he built with his bare hands might not be the same when he returned. While Frank was unconscious in a hospital bed fighting to keep his heart beating, Carla and her sister Denise were busy turning his house into a weekend-long spectacle. Framing it as a celebration of life, they threw what amounted to a 4-day block party, complete with a rented sound system, catered food, a makeshift bar, and nearly 75 guests. Carla told everyone it was to bring some light during a tough time, but what she really did was bulldoze everything Frank had spent decades building. His recliner, the one he'd sat in every night for years, was tossed to the curb. Family photos that once lined the hallway were taken down and replaced with modern art prints Carla ordered online. His old toolboxes were cleared out to make room for decorative storage. Denise, playing hostess, bragged loudly that they were finally updating the place. But the worst offense happened out back. Troy, Carla's son, decided to turn Frank's shed, his sanctuary, into a personal music studio. Without asking, he gutted the workbenches, sold thousands of dollars worth of tools online, and ripped out the wall shelving Frank had built by hand. Frank's honey rifles were relocated to who knows where, replaced by beanbags and disco lights. Meanwhile, strangers trampled his garden, parked on the lawn, and smoked near his propane grill. A few guests even crashed overnight on his porch furniture, leaving beer cans and cigarette butts in their wake. Carla paid for it all using a credit card from a joint account, racking up nearly $9,000, 0 cents, in charges under Frank's name. She told people Frank would have wanted us to enjoy ourselves, spinning his absence like it was a permanent farewell tour. Neighbors looked on in disbelief. One even tried to step in, old Mr. Harrington from 2 doors down, but Denise waved him off, telling him, "We've got this, Grandpa." And the music kept blaring. They weren't mourning Frank. They were racing him, room by room, wall by wall, all under the assumption that he wouldn't be coming back. And if he did, well, they figured they'd deal with that later. 2 days earlier than expected, Frank checked himself out of the hospital against the advice of his doctor. He'd had enough of silence, half answers, and that gnawing gut feeling that something wasn't right. He didn't call Carla, didn't even tell the nurses. He paid cash for a private ride back to his property, sitting in silence the entire way. As the truck turned down his gravel road, his heart dropped. From 100 feet out, he could already see the damage. Beer cans littered the front yard. A tattered streamer still hung limply across the mailbox. The American flag he kept mounted by the porch, faded but never torn, was now missing. In its place hung a tie-dye banner that read, "Good vibes only." He clenched his jaw. That wasn't just disrespect. It was personal. When he stepped out of the car, the sour stench of stale beer and cigarette smoke hit him like a slap. Someone had left an open trash bag sitting on the porch, and flies swarmed around it like it belonged there. Frank walked up slowly, methodically, as if each step needed to sink in. On the swing he'd built for his first wife 20 years ago, 2 strangers were passed out with red Solo cups still in hand. One snored. Neither of them stirred as Frank passed by. He stepped through the front door and froze. His living room, once warm, neat, and quietly masculine, was a war zone of clutter and chaos. Furniture rearranged, carpet stained, some kind of incense burning in the corner. On the couch sat Denise, scrolling through her phone like she owned the place, with her bare feet kicked up on his coffee table. She looked up, blinked once, and said, "Oh, you're home." In the kitchen, Carlos stood by the counter, chatting with a woman Frank didn't recognize. She held a wine glass, her hair pulled back, acting like she was the host of a house she'd bought herself. She turned toward him with that same easy smile she always used to calm him down and said, "You're back early. I was going to clean everything up before Monday." Frank didn't answer. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a fit. He just stared. The garden door was wide open. The backyard looked like a festival had blown through it. The shed door hung ajar. his shed, which he always kept locked. He saw beanbags inside, flashing lights, and a set of drums that weren't his. He walked right past Carla, past Denise, into the kitchen, picked up the landline, dialed 3 numbers. 911, what's your emergency? Yes, ma'am, Frank said calmly. I'd like to report unauthorized access to my home, possible theft, and property destruction. Yes, I am the owner. No, they don't have permission to be here. And that was it. The moment the party ended, for good. The officers showed up within 15 minutes, a squad car pulling up with its lights off, but urgency in their step. Frank stood on the porch, arms folded, watching Denise peek through the window like a kid caught sneaking a cigarette. Carla met the police with a cheerful but strained smile, trying to wave the situation away. It's just a misunderstanding, she said, laughing nervously. My husband's home a little earlier than expected, but Frank didn't budge. When the officers asked for ID and details, he handed them his deed, utility bills in his name, and a folder of documents he had grabbed before leaving the hospital. This is my house, he said flatly. They don't live here. They weren't invited. And that shed, he pointed out back, has been gutted without my permission. One officer stepped inside and did a slow walk through the wreckage. She returned, eyes narrowed. This isn't a misunderstanding, she told Carla. This is property damage. Denise's charm switched off like a light. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You're really calling the cops on your own wife and her family? Frank turned to her, calm as ever. You're not my family. You're a guest who overstayed, stole, and trashed what isn't yours. Then he turned to Carla. You said you'd take care of things while I was gone. I just didn't know you meant take everything. Trolley came stumbling out of the shed, half asleep, with headphones still around his neck. When the officers asked where he got the drum kit and sound system, he claimed they were a gift, but he couldn't say from whom, and when they pressed him about the missing tools, he shrugged and said they'd been sold to help pay for upgrades. Frank's stomach tightened. That shed had held more than just tools. It held memories. He built it the year after his first wife died. It was where he grieved, where he fixed things with his hands when the rest of the world felt broken. And now, it was a teenager's hangout spot, bought with stolen tools and lies. One officer read Troy his rights. Another started snapping pictures of the interior damage. Denise began yelling, threatening lawsuits, and tried to physically block the door. Bad move. She was escorted out next. Carla just stood there, red in the face, quiet now. When the officer asked her if she had permission to use the credit card that covered nearly $9,000 in party costs, she stammered. It was a shared account, she muttered. He never said I couldn't. Frank looked her dead in the eyes. I never thought I'd have to. The officers didn't arrest Carla, not yet, but they handed her a notice to vacate until things were resolved in court. Frank watched her pack a single duffel bag, her face a blur of anger and disbelief. She didn't cry, she didn't apologize, and Frank didn't expect her to. She walked out the front door with Denise barking beside her. Troy left later in the back of a patrol car. And Frank? He didn't raise his voice once, didn't throw a punch, but he made one thing clear. The days of tolerating disrespect in his own home were over. The next morning, Frank was already seated in a lawyer's office before most people had their first cup of coffee. He didn't waste time with small talk. He laid out the documents. Photographs of the damage, a printed bank statement showing the credit card charges, and a list of missing property. The attorney, a straight-talking woman named Sharon, flipped through the evidence in silence. You've got a solid case, she said. We're going after them for unauthorized use of funds, destruction of property, and will file for divorce immediately. Frank nodded. There was no hesitation left in him, just cold, focused resolve. That afternoon, Carla was served with divorce papers and a civil suit for damages totaling $25,000, 0 cents. The temporary restraining order followed right behind. She couldn't come within 300 feet of the house. For a woman who had treated it like her playground, that hit hard. Carla started calling, first calmly, then in a rage. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said in one voicemail. "You know Denise pushed the whole thing, and Troy, he's just a kid." Frank didn't respond. He let every message pile up in the inbox like debris after a storm. Then the text messages started. Apologies, excuses, even a few veiled threats. Denise went online, blasting Frank as a cold-hearted old man who kicked his family out over a few beer cans, but no one bought it, not after neighbors posted pictures and videos of the party. Troy never returned to face the consequences. The tools were gone, sold online for pennies, and the drum kit had vanished too. A bench warrant was eventually issued for him after he failed to appear in court. Denise tried to wash her hands of the situation, claiming she was just a guest. But Sharon had lined up enough witness statements to tie her directly to the planning, spending, and cleanup, or lack thereof. Carla's defense crumbled in days. Frank had all the paperwork, and more importantly, he had the truth. When the judge granted the restraining order permanent status and froze Carla's access to all joint accounts, it was like watching a balloon deflate. She showed up to the second hearing alone, eyes down, her usual sharp tongue suddenly silent. Frank didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The law was doing what he came for, restoring what was his. One judgment at a time. The day of the final hearing arrived like a storm front, tense, heavy, and long overdue. Frank walked into the courthouse in a crisp button-down and boots polished like they hadn't been in years. He didn't bring anyone with him. He didn't need support. He had evidence, and that was enough. Carla was already seated when he entered, dressed down and looking smaller than he remembered. No Denise. No Troy. Just Carla, staring at the table like the courtroom lights were too bright. When the judge asked for opening remarks, Carla's attorney claimed the events were a tragic misunderstanding rooted in emotional distress. He said she was under the impression that, as Frank's wife, she had authority to make household decisions, and that the party was a therapeutic gathering to cope with the fear of losing him. Frank sat stone-faced. When it was his turn, he didn't give a speech. He handed over bank statements, photographs of the house before and after, a notarized neighbor's statement from Murph to Harrington, and a thumb drive containing video footage from a backup security camera in the shed. One clip showed Denise directing movers. Another showed Troy laughing while setting up sound equipment saying, "Frank's not coming back. Let's go big." The courtroom was dead quiet. Carla's face drained of color. Her attorney paused, whispering frantically. The judge reviewed the evidence silently, flipping through photos and documents for several long minutes. Then he looked at Carla. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," he said flatly. "This was entitlement. You treated this home like it was yours to repurpose. It wasn't. And it still isn't." What followed was swift and final. The court granted Frank an uncontested divorce, sole ownership of the property, and ordered Carla to pay restitution of $18,500.00 for damages and unauthorized use of funds. Troy, now subject to an active bench warrant, was named in the ruling as liable for the theft of tools and destruction of private property. Denise was barred from coming within 500 feet of Frank or his home. Carla tried to object, her voice cracking as she stood up. Something about being caught in a bad moment, but the judge silenced her with a hand. That moment lasted 4 days and cost this man his home, his peace, and his trust. Frank didn't smile, he didn't flinch. He just thanked the judge and walked out with his head high. Outside the courthouse, he stood for a moment, letting the sun hit his face, not in victory, but in quiet closure. They hadn't just tried to steal his things. They'd tried to rewrite his life, and the court had given it back. Brick by brick, dollar by dollar, truth by truth, judgment had come. and it landed exactly where it needed to. The first thing Frank did after the court rulings was walk back into his home and take a long, deep breath. It still smelled faintly of cheap wine and stale smoke, but the silence felt good, honest. Over the next week, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work, not because he had to, but because he wanted to reclaim every inch of space they'd tried to overwrite. He started with the backyard, hauling away broken lawn chairs and trash. He replanted the garden with new soil and hardy perennials, nothing too fancy but solid, dependable, like him. Inside, he stripped out every piece of furniture Carla had brought in, replacing it with second-hand finds and pieces he restored himself. His old recliner had been tossed, so he bought a better one. Wider, firmer, a seat he could call his own again. Then came the shed. That took the longest. The stolen tools were gone for good, but Frank didn't let that stop him. He made lists, tracked down replacements, and slowly rebuilt his workshop from the ground up. He repainted the walls, replaced the busted lock with a digital keypad, and hung up the old picture of his first wife that had somehow survived the chaos, dusty but intact. He even bought a new American flag and mounted it back on the porch, right where it belonged. When a neighbor asked if he needed help, Frank just smiled and said, "I've got it covered." But he meant more than repairs. He meant his life. Piece by piece, he was putting it back together. Not to forget what happened, but to prove it didn't define him. Every nail driven, every paint stroke was a small act of healing. The house might have been wrecked, but the foundation held, and that Frank knew was enough to start fresh. Some evenings now, Frank just sits on the front porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the sun drop behind the trees and the wind move through the garden he brought back to life. No more noise. No more walking on eggshells in his own house, just the sound of cicadas, the soft creak of the porch swing, and peace. Real peace. Not the kind you pretend to have to keep others comfortable. The house is quiet, but not empty. It's full of his choices again. His hands fixed every room, but it was his will that truly restored it. He often thinks back to the moment he stepped through that front door after the hospital. How it felt like walking into someone else's nightmare. But now, it's his again. The way it always should have been. He doesn't waste time regretting Carla or the people she brought with her. They showed him something valuable, that trust should be earned, not assumed, and that dignity can't survive in silence. He stood up, fought back, and reclaimed what they thought he'd never miss. He learned that sometimes losing people isn't a loss at all. Sometimes it's the only way to find what matters most. The flag waves again, the shed light is on, and Frank, sitting steady in his new chair, knows one thing for sure. This life is his, and nobody's taking it from him again. Frank's story is a hard lesson in trust, boundaries, and standing up for what's yours. He gave people the benefit of the doubt, his home, his money, his silence, until they took too much and expected him to do nothing. But Frank reminded us that quiet doesn't mean weak. When pushed to the edge, he didn't break. He pushed back. He showed that dignity isn't something you beg for. It's something you protect. And he took back everything that mattered without screaming, without fists, just truth, resolve, and action. This story isn't just about a man fixing his house. It's about a man reclaiming his power, his peace, and his purpose. If you've ever felt disrespected in your own home, overlooked in your own life, or pushed aside by people who thought they knew better, remember, Frank, you don't need permission to stand your ground. If this hit home for you or made you think of someone who needs to hear it, do us a favor, like this video, subscribe for more stories that speak truth, and share it with someone who's ready to take their life back. Sometimes all it takes is one moment to say, "Enough, this ends now."